in the den of iniquity. Vicinity no pretty, calamity fi hit we any moment. What a pity. Tomorrow never certain. What dwells behind the curtain? The face of evil lurking with that shifty eyes averting. It's not a steady bubble that either pop or topple. Many will fall and stumble. Let the dozers gather rubble. From LA to Colorado, Guinea to Burkina Faso. Cannons could reach the towers and the troops will storm the castle. I say, run, run, come, make we get it. Because the peace that is bestowed upon the meek is overrated. So run, run, come, make we get it. Calling all your daughters and your sons, we come forget it. I say, run, run, come, make we get it. Because the peace that is bestowed upon the meek is overrated. Lord, run, run, come, make we get it. Calling all your daughters and your sons, we come forget it. With the rubble steady rising and hearts are compromising. Convictions here are stifling, making evil appetizing. The fists are steady forming and countenance is falling. Defenses are withdrawing, possibilities are falling. In these your circumstances, evil will make advances. Pick up your sword and lances and be sure to take your stances. Victory is never promised, the battle is upon us. Gather the brave and honest and the righteous in your corners.
Welcome. My name is Ike. Welcome to my channel. And let's get one thing out of the way. Click that like button. Click that subscribe button if you have not already. And click the bell button twice. On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. Yes, a household name, if you will. Right? One of the most popular works out there. Darwin shows how species gradually change and adapt, evolve to meet the dictates of fitness, to meet the local environment, right? Shows this gradual change. But does he actually explain the origin of species as the work purports to? The work is called On the Origin of Species. And what does Darwin's findings have to do or have to tell us with the origins of species? That, amongst other things, is going to be the fodder for our conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, again, thank you. As you come in, click that like button, share the stream, and we have our guest here. Mr. J. Ibrahim, want to try out your internet? Do you have African internet these days, or are you in the Mediterranean or something?
You are still a comedian.
Well, I guess your internet still sucks.
But can you hear me well?
Well, it's good enough. It'll do. We will let Little Rock and the others in the chat, okay, give a 1 if J. Ibrahim's internet and his voice is good enough to have this conversation, ladies and gentlemen. And we will be reviewing, okay, a book called The Deniable Darwin by a man called David Berlinski, okay? And we're going to get into this idea of origin of species, okay, which there's this sharp difference between one species and the other, but we don't see this smooth, gradual change that evolution would suggest in the fossil data, right? Instead, what we see is, and there are many other things such as the Cambrian Explosion. And I know that I'm just dropping these little hidden things all over the place to people who don't know the map yet, but yes, we're just beginning where we're talking about, does the origin of species actually explain the origin of species? Does evolution, the gradual change to local gradual change as a result of local environmental pressures, does that explain the change from one species to the other, or the origin of a species? What is a different species? When does it become, when along this change, J. Ibrahim, does the species be, it's like now, okay, now it's a dog. Any comments about that in general before we play this work here? Do we see the issue there of that continuity, that gradual versus discrete and discontinuous? Any comments there, sir?
Well, the issue depends on who you ask. If you ask the Christians or the Muslims, they will tell you that you cannot go from kind to another kind, but within each specific species can move around it. You can get a dog that comes specialized as another dog, but you cannot go from a dog to a cat.
So the idea of that leap from dog to cat, okay, and how a species become a new
Mind
species.
body problem.
Well, we're not going to accept that kind of stuff today, because we're going to build something, as usual, right? We're going to build something here. So let me play the video. I think the video will be able to give us a track, right? And then I think it'll be great because then you can hop around with your generalizations, and the video will give us some grounding here. So what the nature of the problem is, the problem of evolution and speciation, evolution and the origin of species. Does the gradual change which Darwin describes actually answer the question of speciation? Anyways, let us see here. Fair use, ladies and gentlemen. I think let's start out with a nice 1.25. I never heard anybody. Let's go.
Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. We're shooting today in Italy, in Fiesole, a town in the hills just above Florence. And academic and author David Berlinski is a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture and a contributing editor at Inference, International Review of Science. Dr. Berlinski holds a doctorate in philosophy from Princeton, performed postdoctoral work in molecular biology at Columbia, and has taught philosophy, mathematics, and English at institutions such as Stanford, Rutgers, and the City University of New York, and the Université de Paris. His books include The Devil's Delusion, Atheism and Its Scientific Pretensions, and The Deniable Darwin and Other Essays. David Berlinski, welcome.
Thank you so much.
I have to speak for just a moment about David Gelernter, the Yale computer scientist who just this past spring published an essay in the Claremont Review of Books called Giving Up Darwin, quotation. There's no reason to doubt that Darwin successfully explained the small adjustments by which an organism adapts to local circumstances, changes to fur density or wing style or beak shape. Yet, there are many reasons to doubt whether he can explain the big picture, not the fine-tuning of species, but the emergence of new ones.
So more or less what I said is what I see here. In other words, evolution, the data and the graph drawn, okay, by Darwin shows, okay, little change, it is gradual, it is smooth, right? But how then do you get to the jump? And this is not a question of saying that this is not a question of just throwing mud in the water or whatever my silly analogy is here, reference is, metaphor, whatever. But it's to say, hey, let's look at the truth of this and let's tackle the real question here of our knowledge of what a species is and speciation and how it occurs, rather than just say, well, we'll deal with this discontinuity later. You said mind-body problem when what was stated on the screen was stated. The problem of this. Now, why did you relate it to the mind-body problem?
The problem is simple. At what point does one species lead to the creation or origin of a new species? That is the problem.
I think perhaps if you speak slower, because maybe your internet will be able to keep up with your... Well, we got you. You said the problem basically, you're saying, when does one species give rise to another, right? Now, interesting. Explain further why that is analogous to the mind-body problem.
Because imagine our dog, and in the evolutionary process, it states that the dog came from a previous animal, which then deviates to a different kind of animal. Where is the evidence that that original ancestor became the dog? Is there a way that there's a mating between that species itself? Or what is the origin? The problem with evolution theory, like the theory of the soup, is that it does not quite explain origin. It explains change, which, if you take it as that, gives you a lot to deal with. But it does not tell you the points which things are completely different. A dog is completely different from a fish. At which point does a fish and dog relate to each other?
Okay. At which point does a dog and a fish relate? So, this problem, do you think scientifically, therefore, we should continue to pursue this problem, right? The problem of, well, how do these species come into being? We see how they change locally, but how do they actually come into being? But hold on to that one for a second, okay? I just want to make sure that we're all coming along, right? And I want to continue to use the video, as I said, as a means of pacing us along this conversation here about what evolution says and then what the origin of species means. The origins of species has a question, such as Ibrahim asked about, well, at what point does the fish become the dog along this gradual change? And if all you see is smooth change, you're never going to be able to put a pin somewhere as to, then there is no such thing as a species. Am I making sense, Ibrahim, if I were to say that? Am I doing something unneat there philosophically if I was to say, if there is a smooth change, a differentiable curve, that at what point do you then say, how do you cut that? Am I crazy for doing that, for saying that?
First, I believe I did not explain the mind-body problem properly. Mr. Awesome has asked me to give more direction of what we need. The human body, or the human itself, has both a mind and a body. The two seem to be connected, but we cannot see where the tethers are. How does the two communicate? That is a problem. We don't know the origin of this seamless connection between the mind and the body. The same way, when you look at evolutionary processes, at which point does a new species differentiate itself from the prior ancestor? Now, to answer your question, Ike, is like this. I don't even believe they are species. There are different genetic codes which can be put together in ways that are either complementary or incomplementary. And this can lead to either new animals being born or not. It is simply a game of logic, of coding. Think of the human, or rather the animal ecosystem, like
Okay, hold on a
computer
second.
codes.
Hold on a second. Before you go to computer codes, which for some reason, people like you seem to think is a good thing to kind of imagine. Let me go even into something which you might even think is crazier. So if there is this field, right? And this field is, space-time causality, gravity, electromagnetism, weak, strong force, the landscape of physics, let's say, right? Space-time causality, gravity, and the forces. And there, within these fields interacting, there are optimum paths for life to form, or optimum arrangements of atoms, of quarks, for life to be and for it to continue. And that these things, when the path is found, then that flow is there. The dog flow is there, or found the fish flow, right? Before you go into your imagine a computer code, I thought maybe that's the way I think. But anyways, go ahead.
Exactly. The whole creation is about emergence. There are some codes from the beginning these codes then, as they interact with each other, they go and create new codes, and the codes become distinct from the original codes. They can no longer fit with the same structure because they become their own dependent things. This is the same thing with evolution. Mutation can occur, and that mutation is making the genetic code different enough that it can no longer be classified as the previous ancestor, but it is now operating with limitations such as fertilization. For example,
Limitations such as fertilization. Is that what you said?
exactly. We have a mule. A mule is classically known to not be able to give birth because it is infertile. This is an example of what happens with two species which are different from each other, but similar enough to have a child or offspring. Usually, the offspring is infertile.
Okay, cool. So in these flows, or another way to put it, these solutions to equations, these solutions in these fields here, and they solve problems. Like the fish is solving a problem in the water environment with the fins and the gills and the sourcing of the food and the things. Also, the dog is solving, okay, problems. It's a flow, it's an equation, right? And if there are two that come together, okay, and the flows are not right, fertility will not be there. I say fertility is a very clear example of I like that, as a matter of fact. But anyways, let's continue on, because I think let's make the scientific case. Because if we're saying, hey, Darwin shows smooth change as a result of local phenomenon in the environment, and we see it and we say, yes, makes sense. I can look at it in a petri dish, for example, with viruses, right? Changing. What does this mean, the origin of species? And I don't think, if I were to say something, okay, I don't think Darwin was trying to say, and that's, because the book is called On the Origin of Species, right? He didn't say this is the, he was trying to add to the conversation. I mean, don't you see it that way too? I guess.
Let us watch the video, then we'll discuss.
Origin of species is exactly what Darwin cannot explain, close quote. Now, David Gelernter is a leading computer scientist, and computer science is at the very center of everything that's cool about the new economy, about the current academia. It's technocratic, it's rational, you don't have to ask ultimate questions. And here's Gelernter going over to the kooky side. And why does he do this? In part by reading the work of David Berlinski, which David Gelernter in his essay referred to as, quote, essential. So take me through a few of your arguments from the Deniable Darwin, bearing in mind that you have a lot to answer for.
A lot to answer for. Look, since Darwin published in 1859, everyone has pretty much recognized what the problem is. The problem is at the end of the inference, we have something we cannot properly describe, a living system. How on earth are we to place our confidence in a process of evolution if we can't characterize what it reaches?
Do you see this as an issue, J. Ibrahim? The fact that he's saying that there's not a clean enough definition of what life is. In other words, of what the evolutionary process is striving towards dealing with, whatever. And he calls it the end process their life is. And just as he begins here, do you see that to be a problem? Or is he playing some kind of math? Because he's partly a mathematician too. And he said, well, the object is not defined well enough for me to be able to draw my little lines. Or go ahead.
This is one of the things which I agree in theory, but when you look at it, principle, what he says does not make sense. If he's looking for that below the substrate, then of course not. But even computer science does not have this. Even mathematics does not have this. There are rules and axioms we create and then we build from it. So this is not really an objection, because if we do not know what life is in its complexities, it does not stop us from acknowledging life. We may not know the inner workings of the mind, the body, or how they relate, but we can know that they do relate. So we can tell that this is life, and that this life is separate from this other type of life, enough for us to make meaningful inferences. A human being is different enough from a dog that we can clearly say they are both some type of life, but they are both distinct enough. So the fact that we do not know the system called life, or have not defined it to a way that is inside this box, I do not believe that is a good objection. But I'm also sure that is not really the full objection of his point.
Yeah. Otherwise, he would not have these many books and have these many accolades and be sitting with his fancy suit in this place in Italy and getting interviewed. If all... So let's see. I'm sure he's got some actual beefs, and there is something about the data. In other words, the fossil data, which needs to be acknowledged at some point, right? So let's get there.
Confidence in a process of evolution if we can't characterize what it reaches. That's an essential problem, not only for a dynamic theory of life, but any learning theory, for example. If you can't characterize what an organism has learned, you don't know how to evaluate a learning theory. By the same token, what we do know of living systems is a degree of complexity that's almost unfathomable. It's complexity wrapped up in complexity, wrapped up in complexity, forming an endless panorama of labyrinths. And we simply have no way of reconciling the kind of primitive mechanism we see in local variation, random mutation, and natural
Which Darwin did describe correctly. He was on to something there.
Sort of something. He had a local theory of change, but he had nothing like a global theory. And this is...
Okay, cool. So first and foremost, okay, his first objection, which you said is not really much of an objection. He's talking about a clear definition of life, clear definition of that which evolution is striving towards, a clear definition of what the organism learns. Interesting way of putting it, right? But now he's talking about local theory of change versus a global theory of change. Okay. Now, if something were fractal, one could infer that certain kinds of local patterns perhaps repeat globally. But I assume here, and feel free to comment on this, because I believe it's another category of issue he has, which is local versus global, that he is saying that this local smooth pattern does not explain something that's quite discontinuous about speciation or something. What do you have to say about, so far, his raising of the local theory versus a global theory?
In simple terms, the Christians and the Muslims believe local changes. This is, they believe that you can get a dog turning into a different dog, a more specialized dog, because this can be explained by mutations or just change, an adaptation to the environment. For example, if a dog which is bigger and they are having to hunt big animals because of change of the kind of animal in the environment, the bigger dog will outcompete the smaller dogs, and of course, they're going to eat more and breed more, and you'll have a change into more big dogs. For example, for the dogs that had bigger fangs, this is local mutations or adaptation to the environment. What he's saying is there's no mechanism for the change to a global system from the dog into another species that is supposed to come afterwards, which is completely different in a very global sense. A monkey to a human being, or an Australopithecus to a human being. There is no real definition or system or mechanism. In fact, he's talking about the lack of mechanism. Mutation does not explain it because of the complexities. As he mentioned, living systems are composed of complexities within complexities within complexities. So random mutations, which again are random, occur very limited sense, even across millions of years, cannot explain the change due to the complexities. If, imagine, you have a computer code, you have an encryption. If one of those codes changes, Imagine the letters are A, B, X, Z, all the way up to 2 billion different keys. If the keys change at some point, to decode it, to still take you billions of years to decode.
Mm-hmm.
So if we use the same abstraction,
Combinatorial explosion. I know that's combinatorial explosion is
Right.
different. Is it slightly different? But anyways, go ahead.
so if we use random mutation, which occurs on sometimes, and imagine you have a mutation for the skin color, you would need a mutation for the metabolic system, for the height, for the bone density, for the reproduction. All of these changes cannot be accounted for global systems because the compositions of the two seemingly dissimilar creatures like Australopithecus and the modern man, even if you account for 2 or 3 million years, cannot be inferred due to reason that one came from the first to the second due to the mechanism of mutation. And he has not explained a separate mutation mechanism.
Mechanism being the deal here. I like it because when I first heard this, when he just first said local theory versus global theory, I cycled through similar examples in my mind, which I know they're not good analogies, but I cycled through effective theories, for example, theories that work within scales. Let's say, you know, the whole Newtonian thing, and then the Einsteinian thing for the big, and then the quantum mechanical thing for the small, that kind of stuff like that. But that's not really what's going on here. Okay. It's not an effective theory. It just does not deal with,
There
there
are
is no
other
mechanism.
theories.
So let's continue the video then, ladies and gentlemen. And I think that the video has been so far. Let me ask you then. You think the video is good at pacing us, or what are your thoughts?
I think it is doing good.
All right. We shall continue. He has beef with local versus global theory of change, speciation, such.
Local theory of change. But he had nothing like a global theory. And this is what we're lacking.
All right. Let me ask you if I may, David. I made notes. I read
Sure.
that master essay, The Deniable Darwin, and I just made notes. I'm a layman. You're a scientist. I'm going to ask you to make me understand the fossil record. This is you writing in The Deniable Darwin. Quote, if life progressed by an accumulation of small changes, as Darwin suggests, the fossil record should reflect this.
Shout out, ladies and gentlemen. Again, please go ahead and click that like button as you come in. So, combinatorial explosion. I was the one that used the term. Okay. J. Ibrahim, would you mind explaining it? Okay. To the person asking. And if, because I think if I were to give it a shot, I would basically say that if you had a code that was 3 digits long, for example, in order for me to crack it, right, it takes a certain number of tries. When you have a code that's 50 digits long, in order for me to guess all the possible combinations of those, the amount of possible combinations of these explodes dramatically. Okay, that's what's called combinatorial explosion. J. Ibrahim, can you do a better job explaining?
I will do a different job. Imagine you have 2 balls. It is actually the theory of entropy in natural science. If you have 2 balls, and those 2 balls are constrained within a bucket, there are only several ways those 2 balls can react with each other, hit each other, or they hit the edge of the bucket. But if you add something else to it, for example, you add 5 balls, those balls can hit each other in millions of different ways, causing millions of different kind of forces being applied to the bucket.
Yeah,
The
millions
point
of
is-
different possible futures too, you know, and those kinds of things. Anyways, go ahead.
Exactly. No, in fact, this is a bad example. Let us use a card game. If you have a game of cards with just 4 cards, you can do the maths, maybe 64 different combinations. I'm just guessing there. I did not do the maths. But if you have far more cards, I believe there are 30 or 32, please do not quote me. But a normal set of cards has a near infinite number of combinations. Notice you start off with 2 combinations. Sorry, you start off with 1 combination if it's just 1 card. Then you have 2 cards, you have several combinations. You have 6 cards, even more. But when you have the full deck of cards, there's trillions of combinations. This is how complexity works. The more data set you add, the far more combinations you can have, to a point where you think just because it is 32, it should be 200, but it becomes trillions. A simple one is when there was a king. A king was told by someone, I will get rid of all the monsters in your village. The man defeated the monsters. The king said, what do you want? The man asked for what? Rice. He said, give me a rice that fits in something. I forgot the exact way to phrase it. But he asked for a certain amount of grains of rice. And the king laughed, thinking, this is easy. But when he started to add the rice, notice the rice was more than what the kingdom could provide.
Yeah, I think he had it had something to do with maybe it was a chessboard or some kind of I forget. That's a good one. I recall, but I should look it up. But continuing, okay, and combinatorial explosion comes into play because whenever you're talking about chance occurrence, randomness, things bumping into each other, as you said, billiard balls. Let's say you have the original, because we're not even talking about the origin of life per se, but we can even bring that in there in terms of the primordial ooze, in terms of, let's say, biochemistry, amino acids, carbohydrates,
I remember.
nucleic acids. You remember, you said?
He said to double the number of rice grains at each of the 64 pieces on the chessboard.
Oh, so give me 1 for this one, and then double it to this one, and then double it for the next one. Yeah, we tend not to understand that kind of exponential explosion. Okay, there's something about folding a piece of paper 52 times, and it reaches from here to the moon. Obviously, you can't fold it 52 times, but I forget the number of times. But we just kind of can't imagine how those things tend to just explode, right? But within the space of things bumping up against each other and then finding paths towards solving the life problem, right? If that's the way it works, just this kind of bumping up against each other. There's just too much variation out there. Too many. Let's let the video pace us, okay? Let's continue. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming in. The super chat button is working nice and well, I believe. Don't be afraid to use it.
That master essay, The Deniable Darwin, and I just made notes. I'm a layman, you're a scientist. I'm going to ask you to make me understand the fossil record. This is you writing in The Deniable Darwin. Quote, if life progressed by an accumulation of small changes, as Darwin suggests, the fossil record should reflect this. Little organisms, slightly more complicated than that, and in a smooth progression to David Berlinski and me, say, or at least to dinosaurs. But before the Cambrian era, a brief 600 million years ago, very little is inscribed in the fossil record. And then, during the so-called Cambrian Explosion, an astonishing number of biological structures come into creation all at once.
So the Cambrian explosion, a different kind of explosion here, is this massive proliferation of species. It was like a species. You get a species, and you get 2 heads, and you get this, and you whatever, right? Everyone was having a ball on Earth. Must have been a great time, this Cambrian explosion. All kinds of life coming up on the scene. So basically saying that, hey, there's some big discontinuity here in your graphs and your curves. And because, if we're describing it in this way, which we've already talked about, and it is a smooth curve changing with the environment, and we see that, and there is a local description, which we have acknowledged. But what happens in this Cambrian explosion? What are your thoughts about the quote unquote Cambrian explosion, or shall we just move along and see what he has to say about it?
Do you remember what Wolfram calls his shapes? Or did you forget?
Cellular automata.
Exactly. We may have to play a short video to explain this, because Wolfram, I believe, is the one who has the best explanation, which is not against what this man is saying. There's a very interesting point here. If you have the Cambrian explosion of over 500 million different species appearing at the same time, this cannot be due to evolution as explained. The current model of evolution, it is linear. There's some kind of scale. Differentiation of species due to small, minor changes, leading therefore, consequentially, supposedly, to animals that you can clearly see the distinction. There must be between the change of Australopithecus 500 million different humanoid species to the current modern man, but instead there is 8. The leap is too large between each of the 8 for it to be explained, especially when there is no smooth, gradual change, especially because of the complexities that lead to reproduction, being alive, and also finding the oppositional mate to also be reproductively compatible. Those two already are 2 very big differences. Both the male and the female must evolve at the same mutative inference for them to be compatible. That itself will create a Cambrian explosion. That will create the issue we discussed earlier, complexity problem.
Yes. The complexity problem, the combinatorial explosion. Mr. Awesome, $5 super chat. Thank you very, very much. Okay. Now, J. Ibrahim, if you would not mind lending us your voice to read the super chat. And I believe he's asking a question about the Cambrian explosion, right? Which is this time again of great proliferation of species that does not match the gradual change that the theory of evolution would suggest. So could you read the question, please?
Does the Cambrian explosion correlate with the emergence of more vertebrae and exoskeleton organisms that would affect how much remains are preserved? That is interesting. It correlates really with the emergence of several different types of species, and yes, many of which were as you described. And for the second part of the question, this affect the remains are preserved. Do you mean because fossils require you to have bones, structure, which then turn into rock? If that is the case, that would not necessarily be the reason why we don't have as many of these changes, because even within the vertebrates, there must still be a smooth change between each of the other. Even if the majority of life was not vertebrate.
Yeah, so vertebrae showing up all of a sudden in the scene is questionable in and of itself, right? If it's like,
exactly,
because of bones, I have the data, but bones showing up all of a sudden is questionable. Is the aspect of the questioning of Darwin's information, okay, and what it has to do with the origin of species, okay, is the question, right? Because Darwin, evolution, what he found, the local theory of change, we know. But speciation in and of itself, we've asked questions such as what a species is, okay? and this smooth changing and this solving for these equations type view. But let's let the let's let the video pace us again. Lest I wander off. But here it raises epistemological questions. Okay, so far we might get to metaphysical questions later. We might get to questions of teleology, for example. But so far, epistemological questions about how we know what we think we know. Again, Origin of Species, Charles Darwin, very popular. People think they know it. Let's continue.
An astonishing number of biological structures come into creation all at once. The Cambrian era, as I recall, lasted 70 million years.
Some uncertainty about the time. Could be more, could be less.
But the argument is that in geologic time, that's the blink of an eye.
A blink of an eye.
And that's not only a problem for Darwin, that's in and of itself fatal?
It's not fatal. There are a variety of explanations in the literature. I mean, some paleontologists argue that the record is there, it's just not very evident. Others argue that there was a large-scale radiation and much of the details are now lost, but there's no reason to doubt that that occurred. But the essential part is, look, you've got a theory that makes at least one qualitative prediction. That is, change in biology is continuous. It's not radical, it's not discontinuous, it doesn't jump. And if you look at the historical record, it seems to jump all over the place, especially the Cambrian. Now, whether they're
Okay, so invoking all over the place in terms of the Cambrian is not special here, that the thing jumps. He's getting back to the jumping. He's getting back to the, hey, you have a smooth theory of local change. You don't have this theory of discontinuous jumps. Let me ask you a perhaps silly question here, J. Ibrahim, from a mathematical point of view. You're a learned man, okay? You know, I'm just a lowly little scrub down here trying to grasp at things. So I think that is there any analogy? Let me not go there. Let me not go quantum. Let me not go Deepak Chopra on you. But can you have an equation that what happens when there's these discontinuous things in discontinuous equations, these leaps, right? Are there any other systems that we see this kind of thing in, where you have the big picture having these crazy jumps? Now, I wanted to go quantum because there is a thing about the energy states that an electron can have where it's either here or it's here. Right? There's no in between.
Chemistry.
Okay, so go ahead. Since I'm not, it seems like I'm not crazy. Since you picked up the thing there, and you said chemistry. So basically, pick that up and go with it, where we have these discontinuities, where you can have a local theory of gravity change, but then you have a discontinuity. I'm going to try to connect my pad so maybe I can show them a curve and what a discontinuous curve is. So I think that'll help, but go ahead.
A water molecule behaves differently based on size and environment. If you have a water molecule that is a single droplet, it's going to hang on, let's say, the leaf very strongly. It will not even flow. The tensions and the forces acting, the capillary actions, is what allows a plant to even pick up the water due to the physics. If you now take the water molecule and go to the quantum scale, no, let's not do that. If we go now to the large scale, we make a water bucket. The flow of the water is different due to the mass of the water and the forces acting. The water now acts with different physics. Then you go to the global scale. You are at different scales. This is just with Newtonian physics. Now, if we are to complicate the system and we have quantum, Newtonian, and general, let us define this. At the quantum scale, light or particles can behave as both a particle and a wave. What this means, for example, is an electron, if we use it as the subparticle, can be anywhere at any time within a defined region. You cannot say the electron is exactly here at this time. You can say the statistics of the electron is around this known region. However, when the electron comes together with different matter to create a physical thing like a ball, you can say the ball is exactly here at this exact time. That is now the difference between physics of the quantum and the physics of the Newtonian scale, which is just as scale. Now let us go global. Then if you look at gravity, the same material, and you put it into space, the physics will then change even more. Now, the physics of this large particle, depending on its size, can either react with other large masses and even distort space and time. An example is a very, very big object with a very big mass. We call it a black hole. This can distort space and time around itself. The point here is there's 3 levels of separation. There is the quantum scale. Things can be statistically defined, but you cannot say it is here or there. Then there is the Earth scale. We can define things exactly where they are. And then there is the global, like a black hole, where things can now even affect space and time itself. Within each of these separation points, there's different physics which are defined in each of the level. There is no smooth change between each level. There is just jumps.
So there is
But
no smooth change that you now, and obviously the groundbreaking work is to be found in regions of space-time where there's interaction between the small interaction between, let's say, quantum physics and gravity, for example, like in the, let's say, black holes and the event horizons of black holes and all that kind of stuff, right? Places where gravity is important and also quantum mechanics is important, to see how these things actually interact, right? But that there is no smooth change from the theory of us level to the level of quanta, where things are, for example, discrete, and then to the level where there's the bending of space-time and such. No smooth change, you say. Now, and then I'm showing here, just trying to show a discontinuous curve, that you have y equals x curve here, straight line, then this is some other thing. If it just jumps to some other value over here, then that's a problem, okay? There's something from outside telling it to do so, right? It's like you have to write the equation in such a way that says from here to here, y equals x. And then from x equals 4 onwards, now y equals x squared, blah, 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 so on and so forth. But go ahead and restate your point here about, the point that has been made so far about this discontinuity and where it could lead us. Play a little bit with me, or shall we say, humor me a little bit. What if I said, hey, that is the hand of God? What if I did the God of the gaps? What if I pulled the God of the gaps on you, or pulled a smuggling in Jesus, or whatever you want to call it, right here? I just for giggles, but then it can lead somewhere into ways of perhaps explaining this particular phenomenon. And talking before, you were talking about things being emergent earlier, which always leads one to woo places. But what if I were to say, hey, what explains this discontinuity here, for example, is that there is teleology. There's a direction that life is being pulled towards. There is a directionality to it. It's not just finding a random code in a sea of trillions and trillions and trillions of possible combinations. We've talked about the combinatorial explosion problem, that it is kind of being pulled. Okay, so what would you say if I were to say something like that? Would you say, oh, you've gone completely crazy? Would you entertain it?
There cannot be crazy in such a topic, because any affirmations would be crazy themselves. Darwin's theory is crazy enough, but we know what you mean. What I'm saying here is this: it is possible that there are, if you look at quantum physics, there are discrete levels of allowable energetic situations. For example, an electron can only occupy a certain level with a certain energy. If the electron does not have that energy, it is disallowed from participating at that quanta. Now, the same is true for mass level. There are allowable actions within space in the dimensions of the 3 dimensions and time. There is allowable situations for things to fit. What Ike and I have tried to come together, even though we have not had this discussion, is that there is an emergent property. Things are pulled towards allowable states. It seems that evolution of species is more to do with having levels that are allowable. The species became that way because they were supposed to become that way, because the codes pulled them towards that direction. All of the other combinations would not suffice because they did not occupy allowable energy states.
Hold on. Good. Let me just repeat it. The species became that way because they were supposed to become that way. All other possible combinations were not fit. They were not the allowable state. Okay. So that'll be a form of talking about something being called towards a particular direction. That this seeming chaos is being ordered in a particular pattern, and this pattern you're describing as the allowable states, right? So far not so crazy, but let's continue with the pacing of ourselves by the video. And it's rather strange. I think we're barely 2 minutes into the video, and we've had so much commentary. We've not let the guy lay down his Mr. Mathematician philosopher here speak. How rude of us, right?
It seems to jump all over the place, especially the Cambrian. Now, whether there are explanations, whether that can be reconciled, the historical record is an open question. But for heaven's sake, let's begin with the obvious. There's something not right in the theory. It makes a qualitative prediction on the one hand, and the facts are recalcitrant on the other. Maybe you can reconcile the two. I don't have an opinion. I'm not a paleontologist. But the least that we should be doing is saying clearly, look, something's not right. Something isn't right. And it's not only the Cambrian explosion. Look at us sitting around the room doing something that no other organism can do, chatting with one another. Now, what is it? What is the explanation for a whole suite of human powers and capacities, language foremost among them? Well, the usual Darwinian explanation, the usual explanation of common sense is, look, it's tremendously useful.
Right.
Tremendous.
Right.
Okay, if it's so useful, why is it so isolated? No other organism can speak. Try talking to the dog, see how far it gets you. They have nothing to say, nor do the cats. Perhaps that's incorrect. They don't wish to say anything.
Cats don't deign to speak to us.
Yeah. But that's a typical example. We have a property that's absolutely self-evident. The power to assimilate a natural language. No other organism has that power. We don't know why we're the only species so gifted.
Okay, so in other words, if this theory of smooth local change describing how things through adaptation, through moving towards the dictates of fitness has to do with the interaction with the environment, which has to do with surviving long enough to reproduce and what have you, then we would see traces of this language thing coming up. Is there some pushback perhaps? Is there not, do we not see, or is there not, are there not primitive forms of language in, let's say, chimps, for example? I believe they can learn up to a certain number of words, or they may have a certain number of words in their language and such. Or is he just talking about the level of proliferation of the whole language and reasoning, symbolic reasoning thing that leads us to be having this kind of conversation to begin with, right?
He is about to make an error if you're not careful, or if you misunderstood him. Many people will think he means that why do the other species not use complex forms of communicative language? However, that is not really his point. His point is more to do with the fact that if evolution theory states that something that has an advantage for survival is created in nature, it will then be replicated across other species because it is going to allow survival of that species significantly. So why is it that only humans have developed this if it is within the code of nature for it to be able to do this? If the dictates is that complex language is possible, and if having a complex language aids better survival of a species, why haven't any other species developed complex, specific language? And what we mean by that is not talking sound, but the ability to communicate with shapes, symbols, anything. It could even be telekinesis. The point is complexity in the ability to name and differentiate.
Aim and differentiate in a complex, subtle, refined manner, right? So let us continue. Let us continue. So far, let me ask you, what is your opinion of the gentleman so far? I know you, as I do, as myself, we have opinions of people uh, when it comes to them sharing ideas and such like that. You know, we're quick to snare at Sam Harris or something like that. But what do you think about this guy? With the 3 minutes, I mean the 2 minutes worth of so far.
Well, depends. You're asking to know what I believe his personality type is, correct?
Yeah, but also behaviorally and how he's held himself so far in terms of he's getting his point across. The whole thing cognitively, which means definite, which will bear upon his personality type. But I don't think 3 minutes is enough. But if there are inklings in particular directions, go ahead and state as well.
Right. Well, I believe that he is carrying himself well. He is responding to the questions well. However, he's speaking double speech. His last point is an example. It may be misunderstood by majority of people as, why don't monkeys speak English? I'm generalizing that term, English. It could be Japanese. But he's talking about some nuances of selectivity and adaptation, which I believe the kinds of people who will get it are going to be spiritual people. He's speaking in a way that I would say, why is there no evidence for God? He will tell you, well, an angel might tell you he's God. Is that evidence? Or is that evidence for a higher being? So at which point do you require evidence? Only the spirituals people will get what he is there. But the other person will say, yes, I don't see evidence for God. So I'm saying that the kinds of people that will understand him are already thinking from a different place. But
Got it.
still,
Okay. My assessment so far is similar. Still, he carries himself well. Let's see as we go along here, pacing ourselves on this conversation about, on the one hand, the origin of species. Okay, the fact that a fish, the fish equation, the fish game, the fish problem-solving machine, okay, solving the problem that it solved within its ecosystem, is quite different from the dog one, and that the smooth change that evolution describes does not show us this. And then we also looked at a piece of data in terms of the Cambrian explosion and other fossil records, such that there've been, proliferation of species and such that the smooth evolutionary theory cannot explain. Let's continue.
Particular example, we have a property that's absolutely self-evident. The power to assimilate a natural language. No other organism has that power. We don't know why we're the only species so gifted.
So is part of your, I want to return to the deniable Darwin in a moment, but part of your argument, I'm not even sure it's argument as much as irritation, is
Probably better.
lack of humility within the field. You say, look, here's what you'd expect from Darwin, continuous change. Here's the fossil record. They don't match up. Maybe there are explanations, but for goodness sake, have the humility to say there's a problem, and the field doesn't say that.
Well, I should probably be the last person on earth offering the counsel of humility to my academic colleagues, but I'll do it anyway. Yeah,
That's a funny, when he said, I'll do it anyways, that was like a funny turnaround on the, it is a rather pompous thing to tell other people to be humble. But anyways,
that
anyways,
would be a good beginning. Why don't we go back to 1859 and say, here's a theory that has certain kinds of properties, and then skip forward to the present day and say, look, the theory has many interesting things. Fidelity to the facts doesn't seem to be among them. It's an interesting theory. It's no gross default in a theory that it's not faithful to the facts, but it's not a good sign either. That includes all the discussions about gaps in the fossil record. You know, when you come to species, there are not many that form a continuous progression. Higher order, you have large groupings that do form continuous progressions. But species, there are very few on the ground, as Gould recognized very clearly. Stephen Jay Gould recognized very clearly. You can't just say the theory is correct and its infidelity to the facts is absolutely of no interest. It's very interesting. We don't have a continuous record. Maybe there's a good reason. Maybe there's a good reason, but maybe there's not.
All right. I sometimes think there's an urge to adapt the Bertolt Brecht. We have a government, let's elect new people, change the facts, change the facts. So here's back to the deniable Darwin quote. I'm quoting you, David. The general issue is one of size and space and the way in which something small may be found amidst something very big.
so again, this is the combinatorial explosion thing, right? This is the whole being able to find the wrong code or the wrong letters that changed in that very long 50 million length code of yours, right, J. Ibrahim? This is finding the solution, which is a species, right? I don't know. I'm guessing here that the solution that they're trying to find is the species thing, but that the problem of finding that just by some kind of random smooth bumping is not a good explanation. It doesn't have the mechanism you said, J. Ibrahim. Just wanted to bring us back up to speed as we go. There is no mechanism there yet.
This is the math of evolution. Can you explain that to me? You cite an example of Richard Dawkins, who is the zoologist, I believe, and Dawkins says monkeys typing at typewriters, sooner or later they will type the phrase, and he chooses a phrase from Shakespeare, methinks it is a weasel. And then you write, methinks it is a weasel is a 6-word sentence containing 28 English letters, including the spaces. It occupies an isolated point in a space of 10,000 million possibilities. Any definition of natural selection must plainly meet what I have called a rule against deferred success. All right, so this gets to the mathematics of random variation acted on under natural selection. Are there enough variations? Do we have time are there enough life forms mutating? Is there time? Has there been time since Big Bang? I suppose I'm fumbling here, but help me to think about the mathematics.
Everybody's fumbling. The mathematics isn't very complicated, I assure you. It's the implications that are rebarbative. You take any combinatorial string, look at proteins, it consists of 20 amino acids.
Right.
And you can jumble them up or permute them in a lot of different ways.
This is what we said in the beginning of this discussion. And he's correct. That is now a very salient point that he's made. That point there, about 10 million billion different combinations there to even get the monkey to typewrite that is incredible. However, I believe a monkey can do that anyways through sign language.
You found the shortcut. Yes. Again, small little problems like these can really, and you know what? If there's anything good that came out of 91 DVOC, I don't know if you see the same thing, J. Ibrahim, is that for those whom perhaps were able or capable, had some of the slight inklings of being able to understand the ways in which we claim to know things, right? In other words, epistemology, okay? Epistemology is the theory of knowledge, how we know. The scientific method is an epistemological framework, for example. So that people, because of all the misinformation, wrong information, right information, this study, blah, 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 started getting more interested in the idea of, and I mean, maybe this is all a pipe dream in my head, pie in the sky, but really looking into science more in a more interesting or interested way, as opposed to it being so alien from them and this strange thing or something to blow their minds, Neil deGrasse Tyson style. Because that whole blow your mind thing doesn't necessarily, it's not engaging with the topic, right? Blow your mind means you're not okay. You haven't really. It's somebody usually okay, and it's usually what happens is somebody that tells you something mathematically using language in a certain way. That doesn't mean what the person who is hearing it is interpreting it to mean. That's what happens a lot. You know, those I'm blowing your mind. Oh, you know, it takes 2 times to go around the sun once. Anyways, I'm rambling on here, but let's continue. You acknowledge the good point that he made about the combinations. Let's play one more time.
Variations. Do we have time for, are there enough life forms mutating? Is there time? Has there been time since Big Bang? I said, I'm fumbling here, but help me to think about the mathematics.
Everybody's fumbling. The mathematics isn't very complicated, I assure you. It's the implications that are rebarbative. You take any combinatorial string, look at proteins, it consists of 20 amino acids.
Right.
And you can jumble them up or permute them in a lot of different ways. And they
Huge numbers of ways.
grow in surprising speed, with a surprising speed. If you have a string of amino acids, 250 amino acids in length, that means you've got 20 to the 250th power as your total space of possibilities. Now, finding anything in this space is just impossible. You don't have time, you don't have the resources. The space is too overwhelming. What you cannot do in Darwinian theory is say, I know what I'm looking for. It happens to be a needle. This is a haystack. I know what a needle looks like, and I can go find it. Yeah, you can do that. There's no problem about that. But Darwinian evolution is blind to the future. All success is local at a particular moment in a particular space and time. If so, how is some complicated protein ever found? Now, I'm not saying.
So, would you mind explaining to the audience what he means by this blind to the future thing? Okay, there's this space of possible finding something. I think we all get that. We all get this idea of bumping up against the wall and trying to find through random and natural selection, all those kinds of things. Okay. But he's saying that since natural selection can't see the future, which is the term, with the phrase I want you to explain, it cannot know what it's looking for. And without knowing what it's looking for, it's not gonna, the chances that it finds anything are just minuscule. What does it mean for natural selection to be blind to the future, if you don't mind?
This is a very complicated point. I will do my best, but I will also say this point is being selective. Because when it comes to evolution, let us even talk about a small thing like an amoeba, single-celled organism. They are going to go towards certain compounds. There is already, even at that scale, a coding that makes them want something more than something else.
So hold on a second. So you're saying that, and hopefully my slowing you down doesn't mess up your being able to explain what we will not forget that you're trying to explain, which is the idea that the future is blind to this process of evolution, this process of natural selection, cannot know what it's looking for at the other end because it has to go win for win, blow for blow, right? I see this thing, I adapt to it, I react to it, and you move on. There's no way of me knowing, oh, there's the ideal future I'm trying to gauge. And you're saying that even at the level of a water molecule and a lipid molecule, some fat, right? And the way they interact and one coating the other, one forming a barrier between one and the other, that even at that level of just osmosis even and blah, 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 that there's already affinities and such, right? Affinities and aversions.
100%. In fact, my own theory of evolution is called Ibrahim evolution. It is the Exact.
Ibrahim evolution. You heard it here first. All right. Let them know, Gail. This is the new scientific revolution is about to take over the, it's going to be billions of dollars made. All right. Ibrahim evolution. Let's hear it.
The Ibrahim evolution works the same way chemistry does and physics. In physics and chemistry, there are things called elements. Elements are things made of different combinations of numbers of protons. One proton is hydrogen.
Mm-hmm.
Then you keep moving on, helium, 2 protons, and then aluminium, the next
lithium.
one.
Hydrogen, helium. Yeah, it's an L.
That's correct. The point here is there are discrete existence of elements. There are over 200 of them. Now, there can be infinite number of elements in theory. However, because of the physics and also chemistry of interactions and stability within the natural environment, there are limitations. This is the same for evolution. There are limitations to the combinations that can be feasible. Not that you try it and it fails, but energetically, some pathways of evolutions will be more favored due to the existence of these speciational preferences. In the same way,
cool.
there are species that exist in the abstract, and the species can emerge from so-called evolutionary mechanisms.
Oh, okay, cool.
Then
cool.
locally, it is the so-called natural selection and mutation that can lead towards the existence of this species.
I like it. I might even deign to restate a couple of things, which is that even starting at that molecular level, there's such a thing as the water molecule at its is the surface tension of one droplet keeping itself together, water affinity, things that have affinity towards water. We have the lipids forming a barrier between water and the outside and things like that. There's already this kind of preferred states going on. And that this goes on up all the way through. And what you can see is, as we described before, when I talk about the fields, I say if you have space, time, causality, and the forces of nature, electromagnetism, gravity, strong and weak force. And then you let it play out, that it's going to find species space to solve these problems. And you're saying that then also platonically, that the species exists, right? And it is pulling through evolutionary mechanisms, these things towards it. And I don't have a problem with that, by the way. And some people tend to have a problem with the Platonic view. I simply see it as a view, in other words, right? I mean, it's like I look one way, I see this thing. I look one way,
But
right? I
why?
see the mechanisms.
Mathematics is just like that. Chemistry is like that. There are chemicals that can exist this way at specific interaction, energy, and matter. Gold only exists on this planet because of the environment of this planet. And yet gold exists in the abstract. Same thing with the species. They all exist in the abstract, but the environment has to be of a certain condition to be able to bring forth these species.
Yes, you're correct. And I was just kind of saying that, and I wonder, I'm asking you a question now. I wonder how you view the abstract versus the actual instantiation, right? For me, I was saying that, and this is a visualization, okay? For me, it is like a view whereby if I look at something one way, I'm looking at the actual mechanisms of working, solving the actual problems that get presented. It's almost like being in the pool, right? Dealing with the problem of the pool, of the waves coming at you, dealing with the problem of the different curves you have to make in this maze. You're in the pool, you're swimming, you're dealing with this is the process of natural selection now, fighting through, finding ways to to play the species game. Okay. But then if I turn my head the other way, zoom out the other way, then obviously there is a form to this whole thing, right? And you can see where it's going. in the abstract, right? But then it's left for things to be instantiated. How do you intuit this abstract versus concrete?
According to Wolfram, he has this theory, or should I say, computational design of cellular automata. These are simple inputs into a system that can create complexities, that can lead to shapes that create their own shapes and logic, which is separate from others. In fact, it creates distinct, discrete examples of deviations from the simple rules that were input. And this is simple. Imagine when you start with complexity itself, such as natural elements, you are going to be led towards speciation. And what this means is they're going to be creating species, and then the ones that can survive in the environment will be the ones that live. It is not that the way natural selection explains that the environment dictates whether a species gets created, but rather the abstraction of that species already exists. And when it gets created, or rather before it gets initiated completely,
It either dies off or not.
Exactly.
It gets challenged. It has to meet up. It has to put up or shut up. It's like, hey, I want to exist. I want to be a real boy. And Pinocchio comes in now, and then Jordan Peterson says, rescue your father from the belly of a whale. Well, we're not going there just quite yet, are we? And ladies and gentlemen, this is not going to be a very long one, okay? And the link is there, okay? Questions, comments, concerns, contributions to this very important topic, a very important seminal work of modern science, The Origin of Species, on the origin of species, which he made contributions towards the understanding of changes, the local changes, gradual changes, not the jumps that we see when it comes to species, it doesn't fit with the mechanisms by which, speciation would happen, or the jumping from one or the other, or the understanding. And I think this kind of a field way of looking at it, that a species is solving for a particular problem, it's a solution to a particular problem, and that it exists abstractly, and it tries to instantiate itself and then bumps up against the environment and either comes into being or not based on environmental constraints. So far, so good with it. But let's let the video guide us. But feel free to jump on the panel, okay, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm outside of the club and you think I'm a punk. I used to like that song. I ain't never scared. You heard that one, Jay Ibrahim? I thought I told you. I ain't never scared. I ain't never scared. All right.
With space and time? If so, how is some complicated protein ever found? Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute the problem is negatively overwhelming, but it is a problem, exactly like the Cambrian explosion is a problem. This is a problem too. It's called combinatorial explosion. It's called combinatorial explosion because I coined it thus many years ago. The space becomes huge. But exactly the same thing is true in a natural language. If you take a high school graduate is supposed to know something like 20,000 words. Is that about right? Maybe half that many. I don't know. You and I know many more, of course.
Thank you, David.
And you take a simple sentence. John brought the book back home. And you consider all the different ways different nouns and verbs could slot into that, and all the different ways they could be permuted. How'd you ever find that sentence? It is much worse than finding a needle in a haystack. You found something because you knew what you were looking for. And you knew what you were looking for because you had a thought. How that thought translates into a grammatical sentence, no one knows. But you did it. If you did it by looking ahead, it's very reasonable to suggest, it's not an argument, but it's reasonable to suggest, life must have some forward-looking capacity to construct the fiercely complicated structures that we see everywhere, like the human eye, like the kidney.
Right. Okay, so properly understood, Darwin is interested.
There's a platonic kidney somewhere where what was waiting to be born this whole time.
This is bad. Looks like he may be on to almost Ibrahimian evolution.
So he's got your evolutionary theory. You need to. There's another high level guy out there, man. You're not the only one. Oh,
Kidney.
Right, right. Okay, so properly understood, Darwin is interesting, but the
I think he broke the other guy's brain a little bit slightly. No shade on the other guy, but
gap between this very elegant, or at least quite simple, everybody can grasp what Darwin is up to. The gap between that and what we actually see and what we have come to understand the gap is, mathematics, Cambrian explosion, and so forth, should instill a greater sense of wonder at what we don't know, instead of a rather smug self-confidence that we've got the problem licked.
I think that the opinion among evolutionary biologists is not necessarily we have the problem licked, but we have the foundations laid, and everything else is the matter of embroidering on those foundations. I think that's quite mistaken.
I see.
I don't think the foundations are well laid.
All right. Design. You quote the 18th century English theologian William Paley, who argued that no one could bring himself to believe that a watch was assembled at random, much less all of creation. I'm quoting you, the deniable Darwin. It is simply a fact that this courtly and old-fashioned argument is entirely compelling.
yes, it's a whole watch thing that, hey, if you're walking, okay, down the riverside and you see a rock, you're like, oh, that's a random thing. It landed there, nothing special. But if you see a watch, you're gonna say, no, somebody made this. Now it's a nice little joke.
Not true. For
Go
me,
ahead.
the rock is even more complex than the watch. Equally complex.
Why did you stab them there? Okay, you got him. You ripped it all apart. I get it. We're not gonna talk about it anymore. Yeah, we got it. But ladies and gentlemen,
Be-
okay.
The question there is a question of being. The fact that you are alive and that there are complexities based on chemistry and physics. The existence of a rock is by itself overwhelming. Because there's a point here which is relevant. The atheistic Darwin evolutionary theorist will tell you that the mechanisms are good. The Christian will tell you that you're operating on faith, because what you're doing is you want me to believe that this watch just was here and not created. That is also an aspect of faith. They jump from the different levels. They say, no, we have evolution, DNA, we have the science, but then they will move and tell you, yes, things can just appear from nowhere and come together miraculously to form this. Logically, it is true, but this is faith. The same faith they don't want you to believe in.
Yeah, so Mr. Awesome in the building. Questions, comments, concerns, contributions, introduce yourself. Go ahead. Floor is yours.
How you doing? Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening.
Hope everyone's doing fine. So yeah, I'm just trying to really just wrap my head around the concepts that you're discussing. I have in terms of, I'd like to. Your theory of evolution is pretty interesting, but in terms of how somehow the evolution knows what it's going to be. If I'm not mistaken, from what I understood, is the premise. So what came to my mind is how a lot of time when certain things, let's take martial arts for example, the ultimate martial art might be unknown right now, but as everyone work towards that, a lot of things will start to seem very similar. Like a lot of styles will start to seem very similar, and the closer you get to that point, the closer things seem in form. So is that concept similar to the one he's explaining
Yeah,
in
let
the
me
species.
take that on for a second, and then we'll let J. Ibrahim explain himself with regards to his theory of evolution. I like your analogy there. It's almost like, well, insofar as fighting, because I think it's the analogy is rich, and because the landscape of the environment and the species trying to survive and compete within it is very similar to fighting, right? And if there is a perfect form, insofar as fighting has a goal and a thing that's going on and it's constrained by laws of physics and such, there is a way there, a form that all these different styles are going to try to converge towards. And that this is similar to the Platonic form of fighting, such as the Platonic form of the species. Does this ring true to your and is this a premise of your kind of chemical theory of evolution? Ibrahim.
There are some similarity. For example, if you want to fight someone and you want to win, there are only a few combinations, ways without a weapon that you can win statistically.
Mhm.
If you do not have hands, you're going to lose most of the time. If you have hands and you learn to move them with a certain level of force, you're going to win more. And as you get more complex, you learn different types of movements, stances, and also action potentials, when to release the force, how to tilt your body. There are mechanics to improve statistics of you winning, including the size of your body. So, if we constrain this system to simply winning a fight or survival, there are only limited sets. It is not by accident that it's one hand and it worked. Because if you used a better hand to punch and it worked, there is no reason for you now to use a better leg. The two are not connected. You would lose that fight still, statistically. So the point here is there are only allowable ways to win, which are more preferable. So there is a push towards nature to create certain forms of martial arts. They may look different, but really they would be more or less the same. And as you said, MMA is the convergence of all the styles because it takes into account all of them and creates something that is superior. Now, this is similar to the theory of evolution that I'm proposing, which is there are allowable states and species if survival or is the mechanism. And it is not based on local adaptation. That is to do change. For example, put your fist this way. But the abstraction that a fist should even be used to the fight is based on some global. It was already nature. It was imprinted that this is the path. And this is an allowable path, not based on local stuff. And if we come back to what we mentioned earlier, there is quantum, there's Newtonian, and there is the general. In the Newtonian sense, there are only allowable actions. The quantum sense, there's, of course, the statistical actions. Then the general, of course, the space-time bending. The point here is the local, this case, which is adaptation due to natural selection, only happens at the us level, abstraction. It can only impact things at this level. But speciation is controlled at either the quantum level or the general level.
Gotcha. So at the general level, at this level, which dictates fist a priori. Yeah, Mr. Awesome, is Jay Ibrahim explaining himself?
Yeah, I'm really focused on trying to listen to what he was saying. I don't know if it's just on our side, but the audio seems like it cuts off immediately after each word he says, so sometimes the
Yeah,
end of the syllable. But
it's hard to tell. Yeah. So Jay, yeah, we mentioned it in the earlier about his internet. But anyways, go ahead.
so okay, so it seems, let me see if I understand. So the variation isn't necessarily determined by the environment, but something else? Or it sounds like you were saying it was already somehow predestined in what forms or what function or what evolution certain species can go down, like certain
Exactly. Let me give you a question. Gold. Does gold exist?
gold.
Yes.
I want to say yes. I mean, there's different states. As an
Right.
element, I know it's an element, so but there's also, the mineral, which is pretty much the
Right.
same. Okay.
So, if we use gold as an example of a species and aluminium as an example of another species, what we can see is that when the Big Bang occurred, there was already an imprint of gold within the possible combinations of protons.
Right.
There is also something called Ibrahim. It has 321 protons. It does not exist on the known universe because the conditions required for its existence are not known. But in the metaphysics, it does exist with its very unique properties. But it can only exist if the environment to allow its stability exists.
Okay, that's perfect. That's perfect. I get. Okay, so it's like an unlockable character in a video game.
Exactly. That is
Okay.
exactly what
That's
speciation is.
that's a good.
Yeah, I got it. It clicked for me. I got it. Okay, so with biology and species. So with that set, okay, so that makes a lot of sense because there is, as far as we know, a certain amount of elements, and then those certain amount of elements can create. It seems close to infinity, but it's really not infinity because the origin wasn't infinite pieces.
It can be infinity. The problem is we cannot know the conditions for us to create or interact with infinity. For example, what makes gold appear the way it does is the pressure, the temperature, and one more condition which I forgot. If you have those three conditions, gold will exist as a physical thing right now. If you change the temperature, gold will change its properties. This is the same for every other element. And even within elements, there's something called isotopes.
Mhm.
They
Right.
are elements with the same number of protons because that is what makes it an element, but with a different number of neutrons. Sometimes it might make it unstable or exist in smaller numbers. This is the abstraction for species which do not, even if they have almost the right properties, does not really exist because there's something missing. So, for example, there is uranium, I believe 235, 236, etc. Some of them are not useful for nuclear technology. Meanwhile, others are. Same thing for speciation. There are going to still be combinations which are almost exact, but do not materialize because they are missing something. If the environment now is when the local adaptation comes in, natural selection, the one which is now slightly better served in this environment will be the one that propagates and continues to exist. But you will never have a dog speaking in human language with the human cognition. You might get a dog speaking in human language, but it will not have the human cognition. There are combinations which might be close, like a parrot can speak, but a parrot cannot abstract. There are going to be some dead ends because It is just not designed that way. A gold cannot turn into, sorry, lead cannot turn into gold unless you put a significant amount of energy to force the protons to become that way. A dog can only learn human language if we genetically engineer that dog to do so.
Okay, right. So this is starting to really. This isn't much different from how I thought of it originally, but the way you're conceptualizing it, it seems to fit how I originally thought about it, because it's not anything crazy, because it makes a lot of sense. Even the way that it's, I don't know if it's by design, but the way that it's taught in school, evolution, the whole evolutionary tree and everything, branching off. And what happens is eventually, the tip of a branch is where that stops, but you'd have to go back down to where the vertex branched off, and go back up the trunk to further go further up the chain of evolution. So it sounds like the DNA, the genetic material, is kind of the preset pieces, and depending on the environment, certain pieces come into play. But that's limited, because unless you go in and forcibly change it, like genetic manipulation, like you said, then it can never
Their
happen.
own, exactly. That is
Right.
exactly it.
So what's the issue? So Darwin's theory, he doesn't account for this? Is that what the overall topic is about?
The problem with the way scientists, no, Darwin did not even state this as fact. He was simply, in fact, this is a hypothesis, not a theory. A theory in science must have a certain level of logic to it. This is a hypothesis, not a theory. However, scientists do not know the mechanism. That is now the problem, where this man is saying that how does an animal become a fish? So how does a fish become an animal? It is not through mutation. It is the mechanism that they do not explain. But we have explained, at least tried to, that there are species or abstractions of unlockable species that exist in nature, as opposed to you went from a fish to a dog through mutation.
Through random chance, knocking around, trial and error, bumping all through the place. It's like, no, the unlockable character of the dog exists because of the nature of the game and the nature of the stage, right? So it's not like you have multiple different laws of physics, and the game of life has multiple different rules. It's like, no, just like fighting, there's a particular game, there's an end to it, trying to do damage to the other person, and likewise. But anyways, I don't, does that so that is the main issue, one of the issues. But I think that there are others, as to the fact that Darwin, at least in terms of people's interpretation of Darwin, is that he is explaining the origin of species. But he shows local change, which is smooth, gradual. The reason why this particular bird over here in this island has this kind of feather because of the local conditions and stuff, such like that. He shows that. But then the whole question of the origin of species, which his work is titled as, he doesn't. It's problematic, and the data, as it was shown, because of the Cambrian explosion, which doesn't fit the theory, and we don't see a smooth transition in the fossil data, from that fish to that dog, for example.
Mm. So even if the environment was to change gradually, then that wouldn't, well, so I'll ask that question. So if the environment was to change gradually, because I think that's the general layman's understanding of how evolution would occur, from from one species to another. So let's say if, like from the fish example, if there was a gradual change where there was less water or the water level was lowering, I guess the layman line of logic would be that the population would eventually select for more amphibious traits, and eventually, as that environment goes from ocean to marsh to dry land, then that rate of change and selection would eventually produce a land dwelling creature. But that doesn't, I don't know, that seems iffy now after Ibrahim's explanation of
Well,
that. So
we don't see, the theory does not deal with the leaps from species to species, and we don't the record, the
It
evolutionary
does
record.
not hold water.
right.
Yeah. So, but it doesn't mean. And here's the thing: it doesn't mean that those local changes that happen in that smooth, natural way, due to uh, random mutations out there in the world doing their thing, and then sexual selection, and then adaptation, fitness, blah blah blah. All that stuff happens. All that is real, right?
Right.
But that's
That's
not
true.
everything.
Yeah, there is some missing pieces.
Okay, let's play a little bit more of this. Again, ladies and gentlemen, we got Deniable Darwin by David Berlinski. He's laying down the facts. On a very general level, he first named the fact that, hey, we don't even really have a concept for what life is. We don't really have a concept for what evolution is reaching towards. Okay. And then on the other level, he said, hey, there is a problem of local theory versus global theory. And this global, discontinuous, blah, blah, blah. And then J. Ibrahim comes in and he explains the global theory in a, shall we say, platonic way, which is saying, hey, there are these, as far as fighting is the rule, then there is a perfect form of fighting that achieves the goal, right? It is up to you or the system to go through some mechanism to find the perfect form, and gold being predetermined, for example, as a form of a proton arrangement, if you will, right? And all the other elements and all these predetermined little slots that they exist out there, platonically, in idea space, in possibility space. So let's continue.
We human beings, we never attribute the existence of a complex artifact to chance, close quote. Or, if I may paraphrase that great philosopher, William Jefferson Clinton, if you see a turtle on a fence post, you know it didn't get there by itself.
Probably not.
Okay, so again, why is this is dangerous territory? Dangerous, yeah, it is dangerous territory, culturally dangerous territory anyway, because what you're saying is life needs some forward-looking capacity to be able to find those extremely complicated proteins, that if something is going on there that isn't purely random. And anybody who sees David Berlinski take even a half step in that direction says, stop. If he takes another 2 steps, we'll be back to God, the medieval period, and the Inquisition. Stop him now.
Yeah, I suppose so, although I look with unconcern at those consequences. I think they're...
Hey, why not the Inquisition, right? Let's bring it back.
Although I look with unconcern
Is he
at
an
those
ENTP?
consequences.
What'd you say? ENTP?
He's definitely one of you, an NT.
I believe so as well. Anyways, let's go on here, because you see the direction here, and maybe if you saw that already, Mr. Awesome. Saw what? Basically, the idea of some kind of God being brought into okay, you're moving towards a design, right? Moving
Right.
towards things already kind of there, and what are you saying? But I think
Yeah.
that just, well, that's their problem. If you bring up that issue, well, and I'll let you say what you're going to say. But if somebody brings up that issue, my initial reaction is, well, that's your problem. if it has some kind of cultural taint for you, well, I'm just showing you something, which the argument either makes sense or it doesn't. But Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, because I guess that's the natural progression of my thoughts. Is what so what is the source of that
Yeah. What's the source
predeterminism?
of the
Yeah.
the spirit? But here's the thing. Okay, let's say we were to go back to our spirit days. Okay, as the way we used to be, and I think the way it is quite healthy for us to go back to now, which is, for example, we would just look as all these things as spirits, including gravity itself and the river and the tree. In other words, all the wills, all the forces of nature, and in all their manifestations as spirit, right? And and stop asking the why behind the why that never ends. What do you have to say to that? First of all, because I'm addressing you, Mr. Awesome, and then J. Ibrahim, what do you think of the spiritual view?
Well, I think the more sometimes when I think about it for a long time, I tend to think that it's the view is somehow flawed because we're kind of packaging certain laws and forces, and we tend to what's that word? Anthropomorphize things.
Anthropomorphism.
Yes, things that we don't really know the answer to. So in the case of all these forces of the universe is that we don't understand, attributing it to deities and spirits with their own wills that we'll never figure out because we're not them is kind of like I feel like it's like a bookmark in a history book that we have not
Part
yet.
of the wheel, what part of the wheel of a river or the wheel of gravity do you want to figure out? It's telling you its wheel right there.
Yeah, well, I guess it's the source or the reason. Maybe that's just a human condition that
Yeah,
we always.
but you know where that leads, though. It leads nowhere because
Yeah.
because you're gonna keep asking that question.
Yeah. So
Whenever there's the answer, like, well, what's behind that answer? What's behind that door? What's behind that door?
right, so why do we have that tendency to
Yeah, Jay
figure?
Ibrahim, what do you think about that? Because I have my theories as
Yeah.
to why we're curious in a particular way ad infinitum. Immanuel Kant has its own thing too, like trying to said basically reason doesn't know where to stop, right? It just and it makes sense, right? It's like if you build this engine, there's no reason why you would necessarily have like it will know where to stop. It doesn't have a, just like you were talking about evolution not having a future. So why do we go about trying to overthink things we shouldn't be thinking, over ask questions beyond which we should just say it is what it is. It is, right?
We are characterized by the mind-body problem. We want to close the infinite space and time between what makes a mind and what makes a body and what makes them communicate. This is an eternal struggle with nature and being. And as we continue to ask, we will not answer the question, but we will close the gap enough to create iPhones.
You said to create iPhones?
Well, that is what he said. But shout out to the super chat. It's okay to be happy, right? I think we can all agree on that. Like, there's no need to go rain on the parade. It's okay to be happy. Thank you very much. $5 for the super sticker. Okay. Thank you very much. Much appreciated. So we have Big Thug in the building. What?
Let me finish. The question is simple. The reason why, or the future unlocking can be answered simply, mechanistically. Electricity will go towards the path of least resistance. If you have two materials, copper and plastic, electricity will go through the copper and ignore the plastic. Now, you may have things which are more similar, like copper and gold. Electricity will go through the gold. So even if you create distinctions and infinite number of materials which are close to each other, this evolutionary pathway is already designed that it will go and follow a specific mechanism, that is how it works. That's the mechanics. There are certain pathways which are energetically more preferred, and it will be taken. Now, to answer the question about the iPhone, that is now a component of human nature. Our pathway is to ask the question ad infinitum.
So that is how we roll. Okay. It's, in other words, it's what has got us this far, Mr. Awesome, is what I'm gathering from his answer. And now my answer is actually quite similar in the sense that there's this machine, okay, which is called just ask question every, ask questions, kind of look in and try to find a why. That way you can maybe try to communicate it to other people. That way we can all know the why of which plants to eat, which ones are medicinal, which ones, how to build a this and a that, how to hunt, ask questions, ask questions, ask questions. So that machine doesn't know when to stop, right? I mean, there is nothing in the mechanisms of what you know about life or what you even know about machines or systems that'll have an off switch on that stuff. So it doesn't know where to stop sometimes. Is that a satisfactory answer for you, Mr. Awesome?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Let's play a little bit more of this, ladies and gentlemen. And this has been a fun talk, again, attacking the whole Darwin thing from the, hey, global versus local theory, and saying, hey, the fossil record does not show this, and talking about, hey, there's got to be like a forward-looking teleological aspect, and I think dovetails well with the Ibrahimian evolutionary theory here. But let's play a little bit more of this, and then we'll call it an evening. And I'll be back tomorrow evening again for another set of conversations, meditations, thoughts, and whatnots.
Yeah, I suppose so. Although I look with unconcern at those consequences. I think they're neither here nor there. We should have the confidence to follow a scientific theory wherever it leads. And if it leads back to the medieval period, if it leads back to the 13th century, and if it leads finally to the Inquisition, I'm prepared so long as I'm among the inquisitors. But other than that, I think these are misguided criticisms. I don't think the chasm is going to yawn if we say, look, we really don't understand this. I don't think anything bad will happen.
All right, well, let me push back on that. An essay that appeared recently in National Review by a biologist called Razib Khan, whose name, you've read that. All right, you're familiar with that. So let me try a little bit of this.
Sure.
Razib Khan, I apologize to him if I'm mispronouncing his name, quote, evolutionary biology is nothing for conservatives to fear because it is one of the crowning achievements of modern Western civilization. One of the crowning achievements of Western civilization. The science built upon the rock of Charles Darwin's ideas is a reflection of Western modernity's commitment to truth as a fundamental value, close quote. Charles Darwin was a champion of truth, and David Berlinski is an obscurantist.
I guess. The rhetoric alone should give you a little twinge of doubt. The crowning achievement of Western civilization? I don't know. Maxwell's theory of the electromagnetic field, for sure. Darwin publishing at the same time, an interesting view, not his uniquely. I mean, Alfred Wallace had the same idea.
Let us slightly start landing the plane with something that just kind of tangentially came up. But first, Dig Thug is in the building. Okay. I'm going to put a note down here about that science versus chemistry thing that just happened. But Dig Thug, go ahead. What you got for us?
Well, I just jumped in here. The topic is about evolution, right? Whether or not it's, an actual truth.
Yes, in not in so many words. Yeah. And this guy's particular arguments are that it does not explain the species aspect of things, how one species goes from one to the other, right? Or how a species becomes to be. But that explains local variation and adaptation. That smooth change is well explained, but there is a discontinuous other thing that happens with the species, and there are philosophical grounds for him to have these squabbles. But yes, go ahead.
right. So the first thing I want to say is that we do have proof that there are fixed sets, which is entropy being reduced. When you have a small amount to use or utilize, eventually you get the right amount of combinations. But getting back to this theory of evolution, I want to say that on both parties, we have to, one, not jump the gun and say, okay, we should 100% dive into the evolutionary theory that, survival of the fittest and what have you, trial and error. At the same time, we have to eliminate a subject behind everything. What we have to do is look at this from, I guess, a view that, I don't know, if you're familiar with, I think it's called Lanton's ant. I could be pronouncing it wrong, but there's this algorithm with this, it's like a random pattern that has to somewhat find its way out of a loop. And within trial and error, it actually does that. And I wish I can find it now. My computer is kind of slow, but when you have a certain set of information, you will eventually reach a point where that set of information will, I wouldn't say it will discard the outside information itself, but there is this process that goes on. Let's just say, for example, because a lot of people always rule biology as the only thing that falls into evolution. No, it's information itself. Information must, meaning that anything that must will do for the sake of such. Even culture, we noticed that it's not something that's, a tangible thing. You have words, they're not tangible, but trial and error is applied to that. This is something that over time, I guess, with competitors, like you have like certain languages, they compete unbeknownst to themselves, because languages aren't conscious, but the information itself follows the same pattern as biology. So what we have to look at is a fixed set of information closed off. We have to find out what that barrier is, and we have to eliminate any type of subject behind it, any type of intention, because I think from our perspective, we project the outside other. It is said that, and then I don't know who quoted this, but when a dog hears something in the bushes, they don't go, what is that, but who is that? So we still somewhat have base programming. So it's similar to how we look at features, facial features in like certain random patterns. So when we get into evolution, we just need to know how information works.
That is, it is interesting because, again, for me, this way of, on the one hand, looking at the mechanism by which something works, where you're like, okay, you have fixed set of information, there is an actuality, an empirical reality to how the things are actually progressing and happening. And then there is this mathematical space of saying, well, there's an ideal solution that this thing is trying to get at, right? And to state the ideal solution, doesn't necessarily mean you are putting intention behind the ideal solution, as though the ideal solution was pulling. Now, J. Ibrahim will call it allowable states, as though allowable states were pulling through some kind of intentional way, even though a few minutes before I said
Right.
spirit, but spirit was to put to rest the question of a metaphysical question of whatness, of like, what is this thing? What is it? Like how? And it's like, just call it a spirit, okay? And then just get it over with. But basically, not that the allowable states are pulling with intention. But J. Ibrahim, what would you say to that? Are the allowable states pulling? Is this is it relevant to the way we conceptualize the way in which things are moving towards the solution, if you will?
Well, when we say, I will say I mostly agree, but there is still an intention. The intention is the coding, the spirit. Electricity, if you have electricity, it will go through copper and not plastic. That is the intention part.
Okay, and leave it there. Leave it there. Because I'm okay. Let me say why I like that. Okay, because I like Schopenhauer. Okay, the idea of will being part of our way of just looking at, because for example, you have some kind of subjective sense of what it feels like to either have will or volition, or shall we say, maybe you want to separate it from desires and certain other kinds of things. But the point is, if you look at the fundamental forces as displaying their will to you, and therefore, because there is an arena, space-time, causality. Causality just covers the matter part. So it's space-time and matter, or you say space-time and causality. And then you have the four forces doing their thing, that this is going to create certain constraints and allowable states and patterns. And now I almost get to Dig Thug's point and say, why should I call it an intention though? Why don't I just say, hey, that's how it is?
Yeah,
Jay Ibrahim,
I'm sorry.
yeah, but let Jay Ibrahim say why are you calling it an intention when the other way I just described it didn't call for using the word intention? Are you going to stick with intention? Is there relevance to using the intention word? Or you could drop it and say, hey, you could call it a banana if you want.
Using intention is no different than the mind-body problem. The man wills with intention how the body will respond. If nature has a similar spirit or mechanistic property that is set at existence, there will be rules and sub-rules that have allowable points. There is no difference because intention is just the will of the system, but it makes it more beautiful.
Okay, cool. We got it. When you say intention, you're being poetic. Okay, like it sounds better. Would you grant that, Dig Thug, that hey, let's we can be poetic and say it's the will of the forces of nature that the tree trunk come out this way.
When you have, let me just give you an example. In a Nash equilibrium, you have like asymmetric game, like in game theory, you have two, I wouldn't say two parties, but just go with two parties, but just leave out these when it comes to the parties, just see them as two sets. They can reach reciprocity without intention or collaboration. It just happens within the program. And I wish I can explain it further. I had notes on it, but this idea of intention, I feel as though you have to have an agent that can choose. That means that agent has to be outside of that information and observe it. And something about gold and copper, we have to understand, because that in itself is information. So until we understand gold and copper in its fullest, we cannot right away claim intention.
Okay, so we're gonna need to land the plane for several reasons. Okay, now starting with Mr. Awesome and then Dick Thug. Get back to Dick Thug, right? And then we'll get the guest of honor last word here. Any final thoughts, closing thoughts? We'll be here tomorrow, and maybe you can bring your notes with you, Dick Thug. Uh, so, Mr. Awesome, anything to say? Closing thoughts.
Yeah, this is definitely a very stimulating topic. It's just I'm always being thinking back towards the origin of things, and that infinite why you mentioned earlier, and I guess I'm constantly trying to not do that, but I don't know. It just always goes back to because you know the will of the forces of nature, and then it always goes back to, well, why is it like that, or where is that coming from? But um, it's very interesting. This is good. I have so many questions that I don't even know how to ask yet. So I'm just trying to, you know, keep my brain
Yeah,
from overeating. Yeah.
always
Great
good
show.
times with Jay Ibrahim in the building, but I'll be back tomorrow, okay, with with a similar topic, okay, on I don't know the title yet, so but I don't want to give it away because I would say something like, oh, it's on epistemology, and everyone will run away. It's like, you said it was on epistemology. But anyways, so Dick Thug, final thoughts.
Yeah, so I know I came in quite late. I just stumbled upon the stream, and yeah, I will most possibly be here tomorrow. But yeah, this is something I really want to touch on because I haven't made any YouTube videos yet, but I do want to build up the concept that we as a people, as a collective, we have this over sensation of or infatuation with subject orientation. And this is, and then you always hear that, I don't want to keep you too long, but you always hear this idea that, the collective of black men don't build and what have you. I want to explain that it has something to do with our orientation. And we have to get away from being 100% subject first and get back to the basics of dealing with things in itself, for itself, and not for the the gaze of others.
Very well put, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, so thank you, Dick Thug. Thank you, Mr. Awesome. Thank you, Jay Ibrahim. Thank you for the super chat. I believe, let me see before there were two super chats. It's okay to be happy. Thank you very much one more time for the $5 super chat. Okay. And I believe there was one from Mr. Awesome as well. Thank you again for the $5 super chat. Now, okay, The Origin of Species, work by Charles Darwin, quite popular, okay? But the idea is it's a local effective theory, perhaps, work within a certain kinds of boundaries, but it does not explain the fossil records, okay, because we don't see the smooth transitioning from species to species. The whole questions of speciation, when does the fish become the dog and how does it get there, through what mechanism, doesn't seem to be there. We then get to the point of, well, maybe there are allowable states, allowable species, like unlockable characters waiting for you in the game. Like, the fish is the unlockable character, okay? And we used many different analogies to explain that idea, such as mixed martial arts, that insofar as fighting is the game and there is a directionality to fighting, such as there is also with life. Life is out there trying to do a specific thing, not everything all the time. It's trying to do a specific thing within a specific time. So it has constraints and particular forms that it can have. And then when it tries to instantiate those forms, it meets with the environment and it then either survives or dies. I think there is a preference in the minds of certain people to be able to look at things from that perspective, or in the minds of others to want to look at the data. But when one looks at the data, one sees that it does not match what the theory would predict in terms of speciation, in terms of how species are coming in terms of the origin of species. Ladies and gentlemen, the real Stella said she ain't gonna say nothing. Are you sure you're not gonna say anything? The real Stella? Let's see. So rising in the morning and I'm hitting the road. Ah we oh, ah we oh, ah we oh, ah we oh. No particular destination on a ride on the stroll. Ah we oh. Happy evening to y'all. And in this journey I will live, I will love, I will learn. I and I privileged to be on this holy sojourn. Not for the reward or the glory, for searching I yearn. Ah we oh, ah we oh, ah we oh, ah we oh.
In the den of iniquity, vicinity no pretty, calamity fi hit we any moment, what a pity. Tomorrow never certain, what dwells behind the curtain, the face of evil smirking with the shifty eyes averting. It's not a steady bubble, that either pop or topple, many will fall and stumble, let the dozers gather rubble. From LA to Colorado, Guinea to Burkina Faso, cannons could reach the towers and the troops will storm the castle. I say, run, come, make we get it. Because the peace that is bestowed upon the meek is overrated. So run, come, make we get it. Calling all your daughters and your sons, we come get it. I say, run, come, make we get it. Because the peace that is bestowed upon the meek is overrated. Lord, run, come, make we get it. Calling all your daughters and your sons, we come get it. With the rubble steady rising, and hearts are compromising. Convictions here are stifling, making evil appetizing. The fists are steady forming, and countenance is falling. Defenses are withdrawing, possibilities are falling. In these your circumstances, evil will make advances. Pick up your sword and lances, and be sure to take your stances. Victory is never promised, the battle is upon us. Gather the brave and honest, and the righteous in your corners.